This is not the first Warhammer aRPG I have reviewed. Last year I reviewed Warhammer 40k Inquisitor Martyr, a completely different game from a completely different developer set in a completely different part of the Warhammer universe. I described that game as flawed but worthwhile because while it failed to deliver on most of what it was aiming for, it really was aiming for quite a lot. It positioned itself as a tactical aRPG, focusing on high health enemies to make combat feel more tense and focused than the aRPG speedruns that the genre has become focused on. It had deep RPG systems with different damage types and a rich range of stats to draw from. It had unique mechanics per class, like the mage who was constantly trying to push his power to its limit without ever pushing so hard that he would fizzle out. It had broader mechanics like a cover-based system and destructible environments. It had this really awesome campaign that just sort of pulled you into both the narrative as well as the broader Warhammer 40k lore. There was just a lot of really interesting, innovative stuff in the mix, and as a very big fan of the aRPG genre, I enjoyed seeing all of these new ideas in motion. I didn't mind that most of them didn't play particularly well, because I appreciated that the developers were trying to move in a different direction than the genre was typically used to. I bring all of this up because Warhammer Chaosbane is the exact opposite of Inquisitor Martyr, in that it plays beautifully. It really feels quite wonderful at times. But there's absolutely nothing new here whatsoever, and the game feels stripped out, dumbed down, and streamlined to the point where I couldn't wait to be done with it after 30 hours of play. This feels like a game ripped straight from 15 years ago, and I cannot think of a single reason to recommend it to you over the many, many more deserving aRPGs currently on the market, except if you were such a die-hard aRPG fan that you just wanted to try something different for 30 to 40 hours before you return to one of your reliable mainstays. This is obviously harsh criticism for a game that's scoring fairly well on Metacritic, so I'm going to break this down in a lot of detail. I usually keep things fairly high level when I review games, focusing on the experience more than the nitty-gritty, but aRPGs are entirely about the minute details. They're very gamey video games. This is also a genre I'm very intimate with. aRPGs and looters have been my go-to genre since pretty much they existed. So if you're up for 20 minutes of me sweating the little stuff, then let's jump in. The world of Warhammer is actually a lot more influential on video games than most people know. Back in the 1990s, Blizzard was finding its feet as a developer and wanted to figure out what to do next. Many of the people that worked there were huge fans of the Warhammer franchise, and they desperately wanted to make a Warhammer game. Unfortunately, that deal fell through in the negotiation phase, so Blizzard had to come up with their own world instead, and that world was Warcraft. Humans versus orcs, dwarves and elves and undead and steampunk style technology meets rickety wooden war machines of war. All of these were ripped straight from the Warhammer universe, renamed, redesigned, and pushed out as new IP. Given how freely Games Workshop hand out their Warhammer license now, you get the feeling they're trying to make up for what was clearly a very big missed opportunity. When I played through Inquisitor Martyr, it was the first time I'd played through a game set in the 40k universe. I had no idea about the lore at all, and through the terrific campaign, I really got sucked into it. The story grabbed hold of history and hierarchy and technology and pivotal characters in a way that allowed you to immediately see how big and interesting this world is, and delivered a story that felt exactly right for that universe, with memorable moments propped up by strong voice acting and characterization. Having completed Chaosbane, I can confidently say that there's just none of that here at all, and if you are hoping that Chaosbane would deliver a compelling rendition of the Warhammer universe, you're going to be very let down. The game is set after a mighty evil has been felled, and you're returning triumphantly home when the Emperor Magnus has been put under a powerful spell. You're accused of casting this spell, but in the very same cutscene, you're proven innocent, and it falls to you to find out who's behind this whole mess and break said spell. I don't know if the characters I've met during my playthrough are central to the Warhammer world or not. Like Magnus, for example, when I look him up, he's this really big deal with this huge story and all this power, and he's a big deal. The dude I see on screen in-game, though, is just some regular dude. Like, is this him? Is this the same guy? I don't know. Either way, I learned nothing about him or anyone else during this entire playthrough, and when I say anyone else, I really just mean 2 other NPCs and some random boss enemies that seem to exist so I have something new to chase or kill. The story is a meandering mess of nothingness. There are 4 chapters, and at the start of each of them you have no idea what's going on, so you're asked to kill goons until you eventually stumble on the name of the big baddie, and then you chase him some more while he kites you through level after level, and then you kill him when he's in his final boss form. Rather than build an overarching narrative, the game is just constantly leading you by the nose with meaningless reveal after meaningless revelation. It's very difficult to stay invested in this story given how haphazard the whole thing feels. A lot of this is made worse by the voice acting. It ranges from average to truly terrible in the case of the elf character, who is the character I spent the most time with. Her voice is just... oh man.
There is nowhere in this forest of stone that they can hide from me. By shadow and steel, the cult will pay for what it's done.
She's meant to be this young, sprightly upstart, but she sounds like a 60-year-old British librarian asking you to keep it down. She's just the worst. Beyond the storytelling, world building and world design is extremely limited and extremely repetitive. There are 4 acts in the game, and each of them bring unique environmental settings, from the city sewers to a ruined town to an Arctic tundra to a demonic realm. The problem is that these environments are just so small and so often reused. If you think back to Diablo 3, you might recall you start in town, head out into a field, clear out a graveyard, make your way into a monastery, head into a different field, visit an old estate, explore the dungeons, liberate spirits from a prison before clearing the final dungeon space, and then it's boss time. That's 9 different distinctive play areas in just Act 1, each of which has enemies unique to that space. In Chaosbane, Act 3, for example, is just snow area, same snow area, same snow area, some gothic looking area, back to the same snow area, back to the same gothic area, boss. There is so little environmental variety here that I found myself memorizing large chunks of the map before I had even completed the act, owing to the fact that the game forced me to revisit these areas so many times. This really makes the very lackluster storytelling all the more grating, because what the game does is send you into the snow area for a mission, pulls you back to town so you can go through some really pointless exposition, and then sends you back out into the same snow area that you were just in to do almost exactly the same thing you were just doing before. You really do feel like the game is actively wasting your time when you keep getting called back to camp to progress the story, since you know what's waiting for you on the other side of these dialogue exchanges is just more of what you've already experienced. Some of this could have been alleviated by interesting and diverse enemy design, but big corners have been cut here as well. There are just so few enemy types per area, but worse than that, they don't feel distinctive from each other across the different acts. The hordes of enemies that just run towards you all feel identical, whether it's in Act 1 or Act 4, and specific enemy design is copy and pasted on different enemy skins. The mounted enemies in Act 1, for example, are functionally identical to the mounted enemies in Act 3, they just have a different skin applied to them. I know nothing about Warhammer, but if you're a fan of this world, I can't see how you'd enjoy the way this game has handled story, lore, world building, and world design. None of it is memorable or distinctive, and the volume of reused real estate and enemy types show that the developers did not drink deeply from the enormous well of lore that they had access to in the Warhammer license. Just a cursory glance through the Warhammer wiki was able to fill me with more interest in this world than this game was able to after 30 hours of play, and if that isn't a sign of just how much this game squandered the Warhammer franchise, then I don't know what is. I know most of us don't buy these sorts of games for their stories and lore, we buy them for the gameplay. Sadly, Chaosbane has compromised on the RPG side of the aRPG formula so much that I cannot see it appealing to the core aRPG community at all, or even anyone but the most casual of fan, really. It must be said that the biggest achievement of Chaosbane is how responsive the game feels. Boot up any of the classics in the genre, and I'd wager that Chaosbane competes with them in terms of overall feeling. Character movement is snappy, movement speed feels right, animations are smooth, audio design and feedback is on point. One of the principal failures of Martyr was how clunky it felt. It's the opposite here. With a few exceptions, I think most people will appreciate how pleasant it feels to play through Chaosbane. Some of these exceptions relate to specific class mechanics. There are 4 classes to choose from here: an elven archer, a high elven mage, a dwarf slayer, and a human warrior. Each of them play exactly how you'd expect, which I think is an issue in and of itself. If I gave an aRPG fan 5 minutes to guess what abilities these characters had, I suspect they'd be able to guess about 90% of their kit in that time. For a game already lacking in distinctive qualities that set it apart, this sort of recycled class design doesn't do it any favors. Beyond the basics, each class has a unique ability usable with the right stick if you're playing on console, and some other button on PC. The archer will roll, the slayer will use his hook shot to pull himself forward, the warrior will shield slam to stun enemies, and the mage will be able to control the direction of the last spell he casts, so you can do stuff like this. The Elven roll is fine, it works pretty well actually. The Slayer's hookshot is really clunky to use because it actually stops you in your tracks when you arrive at your destination, making you really reluctant to use it when traveling between large groups of enemies. You might think it's intended to be used when you're surrounded to help you get out of a jam, but it's not because enemies will body block it. You also have so many other mobility options within this class, like a charge or a leap, so on top of being frustrating to use, this move becomes really superfluous as your kit opens up. The Warrior's Shield Slam ability is fine, though it's on a cooldown that feels somewhat unnecessary, and the Mage's ability to control their last spell cast feels more like a gimmick than anything else, since trying to neatly steer your ability while also steering your character is a task your brain isn't really capable of. Regardless of your level of mastery, spending that time on other abilities is going to yield vastly more DPS. And this is really the issue that sits at the heart of class design in this game. Skills are woefully unbalanced, both in terms of their base damage and the progression tree upgrades you gain access to. Littered throughout every skill tree are options that are so unquestionably better and stronger than everything else that choosing anything else would be madness. Yes, part of this genre is about experimenting with different builds for the pure satisfaction of doing so, which means taking some choices that are less than optimal. But when the differences between good and bad are so stark, you become very disincentivized to experiment. Just for example, the archer has 3 types of resource generating attack. One of them is a normal arrow, the other one is a dagger which I throw, and the third is a steady stream of arrows that does a ludicrously small amount of damage, so we're just going to forget about that for now. The single arrow option does the same damage as the dagger, but the arrow ricochets to other targets multiple times, meaning it does 2, 3, 4 times as much damage as the dagger, which generates 4% more energy per hit, but that's not enough to convince me to do literally a fraction of the DPS that I would be otherwise doing. My resource spending abilities are just as imbalanced. I have a choice between a large volley of arrows that can be instantly cast and cover almost the entire screen, or I can drop one line of thorns in one specific location and hope enemies walk over it. The volley costs less energy and does 10 times the amount of damage that the thorns do. Why the hell would I ever use the thorns ability? You might be thinking to yourself, why don't you just have both of these abilities and have a build that combines both the AoE damage of your arrows and the power of these stationary thorns? And it's a good question, but when you understand the answer, you get why skill balance is so bad in this game. You are generally not starved for resources in Chaosbane. They generate very quickly. So when flooded with these resources, you then become starved for time. Every second is a decision as to where to allocate your ability energy, and with skills this powerful, you never want to waste one of those seconds on your weaker skills. The problem becomes even worse when you factor in endgame item sets, but we'll come back to that later. The immediate impact of this imbalance is that it limits Chaosbane's already very limited pool of skills. Each class has 3 generator abilities, 11 spending abilities, and a bunch of passives, already putting the total number of skills well behind contemporaries like Diablo 3 and Path of Exile. But this number of potential abilities is realistically even smaller when you factor in their balancing relative to each other. The developers boast that there are in excess of 50 skills available, but this is just cheeky math relating to the various augments available in the skill tree. Each of your skills and passives can be augmented with one of 3 different skill tree choices, but the progression path for each skill is unfortunately as badly designed as they are balanced. The way it works is that you have a pool of skill points to allocate across your build, and each higher skill rank costs more points. In return, you get more damage for the skill as well as unique utility like slowing enemies or applying elemental damage. The issue with this system is that it is crudely coupled together utility, power, and budget. I might want to use a version of my arrow volley ability that poisons targets because I'm going for a poison focused build, but I can't because the only version of that ability that has poison on it is a 15 stat point choice, and I might not have enough budget. The poison version of my spiral cut ability does more damage than the slow version, but the poison version of my thorny arrows ability does 50% less damage than the slow version, since the slow version is the tier 3 ability. It's all so confusing and counterintuitive, it just doesn't make sense. I know this is really detailed criticism, but what I'm trying to say is that because they've linked power, budget, and utility, I'm forced into choosing things I don't want to choose. Good RPG design is about asking the player to make choices, but I can't make choices here. I have to go where the extremely restrictive trees lead me, and I have to choose the abilities that are vastly superior to their inferior counterparts. This linear design is mirrored in the God trees, which are a secondary progression tree that you put points into every time you level up. There's really 4 branches to this tree, and you essentially have to choose and commit to 2 of them, since you've only got 50 points to spend out of a possible 100 nodes on the tree, and if you want to reach the valuable talents at the end of each branch, you need to commit. There's frustratingly pointless trade-offs baked into all of this. One node increases my crit damage by 25%, but reduces my health by 10%. The next node over increases my health by 6%. Okay, I guess. I mean, I need to take all these talents anyway. I don't have a choice since I'm just moving up these trees. And then when I do put points into them, I'm seeing stuff just cancel each other out. It all feels rather pointless. Problems continue when we examine itemization. The stat pool in this game is very, very shallow. You're talking about a handful of stats versus the dozens you can find in other aRPGs. Because of this limited pool, all of the items have almost all of the stats you're chasing, at least at the endgame, which means that you aren't comparing and weighing up things like crit versus crit damage. The item simply has both, so there's no decision to be made except for which has more. As for deciding on whether or not something is an upgrade for you, the game highlights that with up and down arrows, meaning you never really need to look at stats and think about them. You just mindlessly follow the arrows the same way you mindlessly follow where the skill tree leads you. There is the option to bless your gear by infusing it with fragments, but this system is never explained to you, and you need to look up guides to see which fragment does what. Stats like armor penetration are also completely mysterious, so you'll probably just end up piling everything into bonus damage and crit, since at least those stats make sense. I've seen plenty of aRPG and RPG loot games in my time, and I think that the biggest sin that Chaosbane commits is that it aims to streamline the experience so much that the whole thing takes on a slippery quality. It loses the tactile moments of decision making and trade-offs that are core to this genre. I know the best skills to use in all situations, because the strong are so strong and the weak are so weak. I know exactly which skill augments to pick because the skill trees force me into specific choices. I know which gear to equip because it's all basically the same, and I'm simply waiting for the green arrow to appear before I make the jump to my next piece. All of this may please the UX designer who's in charge of this whole thing, but none of it translates to a compelling, long-lasting gameplay experience. And speaking of long-lasting, let's talk about the endgame. You'll finish the main campaign after about 15 hours of play, and at that time you'll be around about level 45 depending on which difficulty you're playing on. At that point you'll now have 3 gameplay modes to choose from. The first is Boss Rush, where you'll just load into a level and rush towards the main boss, killing mini-bosses along the way. The second is Expeditions, where you'll just free roam various maps with no specific objectives, just killing and looting as you go. The third mode are Relic Hunts, which you buy into for gold, and each difficulty has different modifiers that make the run more challenging, like you lose all your energy when you move, or enemies deal 20% more damage, etc. Clear the run, kill the boss to collect bonus loot. Simple. The Relic Runs are certainly the focus here, since these provide much higher quality of getting loot. The Grand Relic Runs, for example, provide a 750% increase in loot quality, where playing at the absolute max difficulty this game offers provides only 250%. Another example of this game not getting basic numerical balancing correct, since the player is incentivized to set the difficulty really low and rely on the absurdly high 750% bonus value for quick and efficient clears. Once you figure out this equation, the loot game is immediately shattered. It's no exaggeration to say that I got my character almost fully maxed out with near perfect endgame gear inside of 2 hours. That was it. At that point, there was literally no incentive to continue playing this game, since the stat increases I might get on newer items are extremely incremental, and the other gear sets I can earn buff abilities that are significant downgrades versus the abilities that I'm looking to buff. I really can't fathom why they would tune their endgame to be over so quickly when the lifeblood of the aRPG genre is a long, slow, incremental grind towards power, but that's exactly what they've done here. It's possible though this decision was deliberate, and the developers were trying to deliver a very finite experience here. Right now there are 4 classes, and it will take you around about 20 hours to level and fully gear each one of them. That's 80 hours of gameplay right there for around $50 depending on where you buy the game. That's not bad value, so to speak, but value is relative. If you bought an MMORPG that only had 80 hours of gameplay, you'd be pissed. If a walking simulator stretched on for 80 hours, you'd probably be pissed. Each genre has different expectations for game length, and most ARPG fans, they're probably going to be disappointed with how quickly Chaosbane is over. Baked into all of this are some very baffling design choices that highlight how anemic an offering Chaosbane is. There's no store for you to sell items for gold, so you can't make more more gold more quickly for quick relic runs. You can't buy random vendor items that might appeal to you because there's no item vendor. You literally cannot spend any of your gold at all until you hit endgame. There's no jewel crafting or stat customization outside the very limited blessing system. There's no transmog or cosmetic customization. There's no crafting of items. There's no side quests. Worst of all, the matchmaking in this game is atrociously bad. If you want to join a match-made game, you literally just hit matchmake and you are randomly dropped into someone else's game. You have no idea what they are doing and they have no idea what you want to do. You might want to do boss runs and they're doing relic runs. Bad luck, you just got match-made together. Work it out, I guess. Some basic matchmaking filters would have solved this, but these have not been implemented for some crazy reason. To add further injury to insult, the developers are selling pay-to-win mechanics, which I absolutely loathe in most games, but particularly in games like this since they are so ripe for monetization. The Magnus edition nets you an XP booster so you reach the level cap faster, plus a gold booster so you're earning more as you go. Buy the season pass and you get an item drop booster that increases the rate at which you earn fragments, which are essentially the game's core currency. I hate when core gameplay mechanics are monetized, and monetizing XP and gold and currency gains is well and truly shit tier design in my book. For this reason alone, I recommend skipping this title. Taking a step back, I know this is a really scathing review, and I know that in the comment section you're going to hear from a lot of people that will argue that it really wasn't that bad and that it's perfectly fine and just play it for a while and put it down and that's okay. I actually agree with this in part. It isn't that bad, and depending on how much you pay for it and your expectations going in, you might even enjoy yourself. My issue is that much like Anthem, Chaosbane seems to have been developed in a vacuum, completely unaware of the advancements that have been made in this genre since Diablo 2 was released 19 years ago. Diablo 2 is a vastly more deep, feature-rich and playable game than this could ever hope to be, and that's forgetting the very worthy contemporary aRPGs you could be playing instead, like Diablo 3, or Path of Exile, or Grim Dawn. I simply cannot think of a reason that you should invest the time into Chaosbane, let alone your money, when there are just so many other alternatives that are better, cheaper, and will sustain you for far, far longer. At its core, Chaosbane feels so lacking in depth, content, and systems that it feels much more like a mobile game than a true aRPG, an ironic turn of events given that developers famously got a few cheap laughs at Diablo Immortal's expense.